There was a lot of apprehension about publishing this piece because it was so revealing. The nude that Arbus submitted wasn't really a nude. It was a naked person. A formal nude recalls other nudes in art history, starting with the Renaissance. This was something else. It was a morbid picture of a woman destroying herself. Many readers canceled their subscriptions. Several advertisers dropped us, and the board threatened to fire Clay. We were in a rather depressed mood during the first few months of the magazine, and it took a lot of time to recover. Without knowing the dynamic between FIBA and Arbus, I have to say that I was in favor of publishing it. We had to do something that people would talk about rather than being invisible and not make a ripple. We chose to make mischief. I still believe that you have to get through the passivity of daily life. However, we did progress, and some good things happened at the same time. For instance, the rise of Gloria Steinem. Gloria was among the first people that Clay hired to help create the magazine in 1967, and it gave her a start as a political writer. Here's how she tells it. Before New York Magazine was invented, I was a freelance writer making my living contributing to women's magazines, always on non-political subjects. The low point was actually a very long piece about the history of textured stockings for the Sunday New York Times Magazine. The women writers were even more likely to be typecast. Clay Felker, an editor at Esquire, had given me my most serious assignment. I was definitely interested when he asked me to join a group of writers starting a new weekly called New York Magazine. It was then I discovered that editorial meetings could be like jazz improvisations, with each person playing off ideas to achieve a better result than anyone of us could have done on our own. At New York, I was able to write about politics. One day, Clay urged me to get on Richard Nixon's campaign plane and write about everything I saw. And she did, and the result was an insightful first-person account of Richard Nixon in the throes of his campaign. We created a cover called Learning to Live with Nixon, and we asked photographer Carl Fisher to build a big box, as you can see, filled with images of Nixon. We were hoping to persuade Gloria to pose inside the box, but she hated this idea. Later she said, "It seemed to me that serious writers don't do that." As you can see, the result was a compromise. I was there amid Nixon photos, but with my back to the camera. New York Magazine was on the 4th floor of a beautiful building at 207 East 32nd Street, which will soon be the new offices of the New York Review of Books. It was a 4th floor walk-up, and New York Magazine was, of course, on the top floor. It was also a time before we even heard of building security. Anybody could walk in if they were willing to climb the stairs. The receptionist's job was to inform visitors that unfortunately the elevator was out of order and point out the stairway. Even 4 floors up, we were visited daily by artists and photographers with portfolios, writers handling in their stories, and even curious readers who wanted to know a good restaurant. Most staff meetings were held gathered around our large flat files in the art department. The art department was a whole department anyway. And full of layout paper in the middle was these large files. Looking at this picture, and I identified everybody except this one guy. I have no idea who this guy is. My guess is that he came up to show his portfolio, but there was this meeting going on and nowhere to sit, so he just hung on until the meeting was over. That willingness to be available to visitors often produced, however, happy surprises. For instance, the shoebox. In 1973, we were, as you all were, if you were alive then, obsessed with Richard Nixon. We published many photos and drawings of the president to illustrate the numerous articles we wrote about Watergate. For instance, this is a drawing by David Levine, one of the great caricaturists who did this for us. But one fine day, a woman named Rita Sue Siegel, who was once a agent for artists, walked up the four floors. She carried a shoebox and said she had an unusual but wonderful caricature of Richard Nixon, and by the way, we should get that elevator fixed. We asked, "Did you draw Nixon?" And she said, "No, I grew it." And sure enough, it was Nixon in the box. We were so pleased but not quite sure what to do with it. The editors thought if we published just this as a photo, no one would believe it was not a retouch job. Finally, with some clever text by our executive editor, we published the Nixon eggplant. And we got a notary to verify its authenticity on the bottom of the page. And you can see that in 1973, my God, it was 55 cents a pound. Well, it only lasted a few days, and of course we did photograph it and publish it as a one page, and our executive editor who wrote some of the copy got to take it home as a big eggplant for me. But another surprise in the early days, because people just came up with stuff, was a young photographer. She came barging up to the floor, and on the fourth floor, and on those flat files, just leaped up and started dancing on the flat files, saying I had to look at her portfolio, which I did, and they were very good actually. She had very good photographs. So she left her business card, and this is a picture of her business card. Her name was Roz Kelly, and she convinced me to look at her portfolio, and then after she left, she pestered me almost every week. Finally, I found a job for her. I sent her on a stakeout assignment to photograph Jimi Hendrix, who was playing in town, and we knew he was staying at the Drake Hotel. But this was early in the stage of New York Magazine. We didn't even know how to get in touch with Hendrix or to get permission to photograph him. So I said to her, here's what you do. You go to the Drake Hotel, you stay in the lobby, we know he has to go out, you do a paparazzi shot that we can use. And I figured Roz could just catch him as he emerged from the hotel to go to his gig. However, Roz was determined to get a more interesting picture. So somehow, she figured out what room he was in, knocked on his door, and got in. Apparently, the groggy, this is according to Roz, opened the door and stumbled back into bed. She says she shook him awake, took a few photographs, and rushed back to the studio. But the next day she came into the office and presented a contact sheet full of intimate portraits of Hendrix in various stages of playful. That was her story, and she's sticking to it. She's an amazing woman. She soon left New York for Hollywood, and she turned up as Pinky Tuscadero on Happy Days, as the girlfriend of the Fonz. Amazing person. One of the pleasures, however, of New York Magazine was the creation of another new magazine. Within our December 1971 issue is the historic premiere of Ms. Magazine. Co-founded by Gloria Steinem and a group of women journalists, the iconic publication fueled the feminist movement and forever changed the conversation around gender politics in the United States and beyond. Gloria says her weekly The City Politic column in New York served as a dry run for the kind of perspective-shifting journalism championed by Ms. Here's what she says. I could write about politics for the first time and the way we experience them in daily life. Indeed, that column was the beginning of my understanding that there is also a need to be the first national magazine that was actually owned and controlled by women. Clay told Gloria that he would pay for the printing and distribution of the inaugural issue if he could publish 30 pages in New York. And she agreed. I doubt we would have been able to afford national distribution of a preview issue without Clay's generous offer, Gloria says. So, the Ms. staff did come together to pull the insert and the initial issue. Our only contribution was to help a little with art direction and cheer them on. Finding their audience was a really difficult concern for the Ms. founders. They were so worried about disgracing the women's movement that they cover dated the issue spring, even though it came out in January, in case it languished on the newsstand. Gloria recalls that as she was interviewed on a call-in show in LA, a viewer called to say she couldn't find a preview issue on the newsstand. Gloria panicked and called Clay. I think it hadn't been shipped into California. Clay called back later to say, yeah, sorry, it had sold out. It became instantly clear that Ms. struck a chord. Within weeks, they received over 25,000 subscription orders, 20,000 readers' letters, and the 300,000 test copies sold out. One of the fun things about being an art director and the satisfactions you get is to help illuminate the important journalism that was published at New York. Gail Sheehy wrote a lot, Nora Ephron, and Ken Olette are just three of the writers who made New York a must-read. And on the left, you can see the painting. That's by Paul Davis, who is a good friend and a Sag Harbor resident. He did many covers and illustrations for New York, one of the great illustrators of our time. By 1976, New York had expanded its reach. We were read in Washington, D.C. by politicians and in Hollywood by producers looking for stories. One of the pieces got an unusual amount of traction considering that it was a reluctant assignment by our editor, Clay. In early 1976, there were grumblings by the magazine staff that Clay didn't get out of Manhattan enough and view the other boroughs. So partly in response to this criticism, Clay toured the boroughs and came back excited about the vibrant nightlife club scene in Brooklyn. So Nick Cohn was renowned for his insightful coverage of London's rock and roll world. We assigned him to report on these working class disco clubs. We thought Jim McMullen would be an ideal illustrator for the assignment because he had a mastery of capturing the reality of a moment. We asked him to operate like a journalist and paint what he saw, going to all the clubs in Brooklyn that Clay had discovered. Jim is a former Sag Harbor resident as well, and is now best known for his magnificent Lincoln Center theater posters. But back in '76, he was a regular contributor to New York Magazine. His illustrations for this article about the club scene in Brooklyn turned out to have major impact. His illustrations really transported you into the club scene. After a few weeks, we had Jim's paintings in hand, but Nick didn't show up. Clay called him and threatened to run the story as an art portfolio with just captions. His first draft then arrived 2 weeks later, and we ran the story. The same week that we published Tribal Rights of the Saturday Night by Nick Cohn came out on a Monday. By Wednesday, we knew that Robert Stigwood had bought the rights. By Friday, we knew that John Travolta was signed with the league. And it became, as you know, Saturday Night Fever. Interestingly enough, John Badham the director, said he used Jim's illustrations as a visual guide for the look of the film, which was nice, except that it was Nick who got hundreds of thousands of dollars for the screenplay, and Jim got our fee. It all came to a crashing halt in 1977 when Rupert Murdoch gained control of the company, and I needed a job. Luckily, Time magazine called to ask if I would be interested in becoming the art director. I proposed that if we could redesign it, I would come on board for at least 1 year. At this time, Newsweek and Time were major rivals. This is a time in 1977 when Time circulation was printing 6 million and Newsweek's was about 4 million. They were major rivals, and as you could see, sometimes just thinking the same way. They both did Bruce Springsteen on the same week, to their embarrassment. Henry Grunwald, the editor, gave me a budget and 3 months to submit the redesign. In order to prevent alarming its staff or tipping off rival publications, Grunwald determined that I had to do this design in secret. So I rented the ground floor in 207 East 32nd Street, Milton's building. Milton was up on 42nd Street. As New York crumbled, he still had an office uptown, not uptown, midtown. And so I got a free office on the first floor of 207. As I started to work, about a month into it, Milton moved back into the building. He then came to me and said, "You won't believe this, but I have been assigned to redesign Newsweek." So on the first and second floor of the same building, the major rival news weeklies were being secretly redesigned. We agreed not to show each other anything and to keep our mouths shut. Looking back, I realized that Milton's design did not have a chance. Because what was needed was not only a new design, but an art director on staff to see it through on a daily basis. You had to design the covers, you had to design the pages, you had to run a staff. And Milton wasn't about to do that, he was just giving them a prototype design. But I needed the job, so when my design was accepted, I joined the staff as art director. Milton was never going to be the art director of Newsweek, so his design was quietly shelved. The interesting thing for me was Time was a whole different world from New York Magazine. It had a staff of 25 in the art department. It had editors for every section. It had interns, it had writers, it had copywriters, everything, by the way, at this time done by hand practically. It took me a while to realize the resources that I had at my fingertips and the depth of the staff available for any task. But it wasn't easy to get out of the New York Magazine frame of mind. In November of 1977, we worked on a major cover story about Richard Leakey, a charismatic Kenyan paleoanthropologist. Leakey had discovered the bones of a 2-million-year-old hominid believed to be the oldest direct predecessor of humans. Leakey agreed to be photographed by Carl Fisher in New York City during his scheduled visit. Carl had a mask created portraying the likeness of the Homo habilis, which could be worn by a model in the shoot. This is what I had proposed. I wanted to be inspired by Irving Penn's photograph of indigenous people in Peru and workers and things like that. So I made a sketch in which Leakey would pose with the model of Homo habilis. Several days before the shoot, however, I learned that Leakey's trip to New York was canceled. He was staying in Africa and I didn't know what to do. So I went into the managing editor, Grunwald, told him about this disaster, and he looked at me as if, why did we hire this guy? Where is Mr. Leakey, he said. I said, he was staying in Kenya, in Africa. And he looked at me as if I had no idea what magazine I was working for. And he said, well then, go to Africa. So, Carl Fisher, a makeup man, his assistant, the model, we had about 4 or 5 people flown to Kenya. Unlike New York Magazine, we had a big budget. Allowed me to fly Carl and everyone to Kenya without a problem. And we got a much better shoot. This is a much better idea, and Carl's photograph of Homo habilis on the exact site where Leakey made his discovery was worth the trip. It was the largest newsstand sale since Nixon's resignation, and it led the way to producing Discover magazine 3 years later. You know, Time was a national magazine, I'll go back one, printed in Chicago. In 1977 and 78, this is before the internet and computers, so all the layouts and photos and art had to be flown physically to the printer. They were put in an envelope. It was all paper, photographs, transparencies, artwork, illustrations, had to go to the printer in Chicago. Each item, in order to go on a flight, had to be duplicated in our photo lab in case the plane went down. Every Thursday and Friday, I sent couriers with a voucher like this with my signature into a town car to the airport to board a plane, holding the large manila envelope with the magazine's contents. Each courier held the envelope in his or her arms during the flight and handed it off to the printer when they landed. Sometimes we had 2 couriers a night, 2 on Thursday, 2 on Friday, and 1 on Saturday if there was a late story. Sometimes the courier was a young staff member. Sometimes the staffer's relative, if your relative wanted to go to Chicago for a weekend, if you want to take our envelope, you could do it. In all, there were about 400 courier town car trips a year. And one Christmas, when I had to come back for an emergency meeting at the Time and Life building because of a Man of the Year cover, I ordered a town car when I got to the airport. And I handed him my voucher to the driver, and he said, oh, it was Christmas time, by the way. He said, Merry Christmas, I'm Tommy, what is your name? And I said, Walter Bernard. He said, yeah, that's what they all say, what is your real name? One of the most important assignments each year for Time was the annual Man of the Year cover. After the Leakey learning experience, however, I was aware that we could send photographers anywhere around the world. This is David Hume Kennerly photographing Anwar Sadat in Giza for the feature that was the Man of the Year photograph. This stately portrait we did of Anwar Sadat was one of the largest photographs that the magazine ever published until that time. Remember, this is 1977. They only did 12 pages of color in a magazine. That was 80 to 100 pages. So standing between 2 pyramids, Sadat was presented as the visionary architect of the Mid-East. The tradition of naming the year's top newsmaker began in 1927, and prominent illustrators and artists had done striking portraits over the years. In order to follow that tradition, I asked Audrey Flack, the pioneer of photojournalism. And Audrey is, as you may know, lives in East Hampton. I asked her to paint Egyptian President Anwar Sadat for the Man of the Year issue. His negotiations with Israel accumulated in the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. I thought it was appropriate to have a woman be Man of the Year, which, by the way, was only renamed Person of the Year in 1999. Another time, competitive saga. In 1978, Steve Coughlin was about to ride Affirmed in a leg of the racing's Triple Crown. The race started at 5:41 p.m. on Saturday, which was past our normal deadlines and our normal press time. So our idea was to prepare two cover stories. If Coughlin won the race, his cover would be immediately go to press, which was all prepared, and be on newsstands on Monday, beating Newsweek, who wasn't prepared to do that. If he lost, the cover would become something else. So I assigned Jim McMullen again to do a nice portrait of Coughlin and had it made up as a cover and all ready to go. But there was a photographer working for us at this time. He later became a friend of mine, is Neil Leifer, but he was the biggest pest I've ever seen. And he said, I can do this cover, I want to do it. And I said, well, you know, you can go over to Belmont where they were training and shoot them, but I really need, if I don't use this photograph, I mean this illustration, I need a photograph that looks like he's already won the race. Obviously, he couldn't take a picture during the race. He could, but we were going to press the minute the race was over. But Neil never gives up. He came in with a photograph of Coughlin holding the victory cigar. That was irresistible. When Time appeared on the following Monday, I'm told Newsweek canceled its own Coughlin story, which would have run a week later. In those days, even powerful world leaders paid attention to magazines like Time and Newsweek. And Henry Grunwald, our editor at this time, wanted exclusive interviews with both these world leaders. First, we finally got the secretary of the the country's leader, Leonid Brezhnev, to think about an interview. In January, Brezhnev relented and agreed to an exclusive interview, and I commissioned Bert Silverman, a wonderful artist, to do his portrait. And it was very successful, and Brezhnev, I assume, was pleased. I have no idea. But shortly thereafter, the editors came to me and said, we have a message from Deng Xiaoping. Chairman Deng saw the Brezhnev cover. He said he would agree to an exclusive interview if he was assured equal treatment. He could not lose face to the Russian leader. So we sent word to our bureau that if he did the interview, and if it indeed became a cover, you could never tell, the same artist would paint his portrait. He agreed, and he did the interview, and he did not lose face. By the way, it says T-E-N-G, and several years later, the English-speaking countries, Europe, United States, changed the spelling to D, D-E-N-G, because they realized it was more accurate to the Chinese sound. In 1979, an unusual incident changed the history of Time magazine. It was about Time's annual Man of the Year selection. Tradition has it that the person who affected world news the most, for good or evil, would be the Man of the Year. And you can see that Hitler was Man of the Year in '38 and Stalin twice. In 1979, the Iran hostage taking and the return of the Ayatollah Khomeini to Iran clearly dominated the news. There are 3 covers shortly within that time period, all based on our relationship with Iran. So in January 1980, Khomeini was named Man of the Year. For the first time, suddenly major news outlets refused to run it, refused to sell this issue. They boycotted the magazine, Walmart boycotted it, advertisers screamed, everybody was so shook up that the editors never again used this criteria. For them, from then on, Man of the Year, and now Person of the Year, became an honor celebrating that person. Remember that in 2001, Rudy Giuliani was Man of the Year because he was the mayor of New York City. And who dominated the news? Osama bin Laden. One of the things that was fun at WBMG working with Milton was the idea of collaboration. We constantly worked together and played off ideas. And in 1996, John Huey, the editor of Fortune, asked us to consider a new design for the Fortune 500. This annual issue is always the Fortune 500 and a bestseller for Fortune, and an interesting graphic challenge for the art director. This is John Huey, who assigned it. And here's a sample of a 1956 and a 1963 500 annual issue. And all done by wonderful art directors. Fortune was one of those magazines who had great tradition of art directors over the years. So he asked us to reinvent the 500 cover. It was really difficult, and because everything always centered on that number. And Milton and I started to make several sketches. We tried with a jokey one, we tried with large colorful numbers, and one using only words. None of them satisfied us, and we didn't show them. But we kept looking at these solutions, and Milton had a wonderful suggestion. We were trying to be big and bold with the numbers. And at the same time, we liked the idea of the type. And he said, why don't we combine them? And we finally proposed a white cover with a large red number 5 in the center along with the word 100. We were pleased with our collaboration because it had the intent of engaging the reader in figuring out a small puzzle. For us, this cover became one of the best-selling issues of the year, so much so that Fortune ran this cover for 10 years in a row. We got, well, for them, they paid for one and got 9 free. You know, we were not supposed to even get the redesign job for Fortune in 1996. After his first year as managing editor, John Huey decided on a wholesale review of the entire magazine, both visually and editorially. They called me. I thought they were going to call me to think about redesigning it, but no, they wanted a recommendation. And I said, well, you got to think about us, about WBMG. But John decided that they needed a new external team to evaluate the magazine with fresh eyes, because I had once redesigned Fortune in 1982. So I called back saying, we have a fresh eye, Milton. He wasn't with me in 1982. So he reluctantly invited us to be among the presenters for the job. Here's how he describes the interview. This is the voice of John Huey. We made the rounds of all the big design firms and took their pitches. WBMG was our last stop. The firm was so well known at Time Inc. On one hand, I was inclined to want to go that way, but on the other, I thought maybe we needed to branch out. I was excited to meet the legendary Milton Glaser. I already knew Walter. We sat down at the big table, and I laid out what I wanted for the magazine to become. Milton mulled it over for a minute or two, then launched into an elaborate metaphor in which he related the restructuring of a magazine to the deboning of a chicken in visceral detail. I have never been able to debone a chicken, and I actually had no comprehension of what he was saying. But I loved the metaphor so much, though, that I knew right away that we were going to go with WBMG. It was a great decision. They gave us exactly what we wanted, and it worked exceptionally well. In the years to come, I would occasionally lapse into my imitation of Milton's deboning theory just to confound the more literal-minded among us. John Huey had a sense of humor. You know, in 82, I got a call from Ben Bradley, who asked me to redesign the Washington Post. At the same time, Milton got a call from Sir James Goldsmith in England saying he bought some magazines and wanted Milton to redesign his first magazine he bought called Lear about books. And almost on the same day, I called Milton saying, "Help, I've just been asked to design the Washington Post. Would you like to help me?" And he called me to say he just got an assignment from Goldsmith. Would I like to work with him? So we said, yes, we'll work together, and that's how we decided to start WBMG. The reason Milton got a call from Sir James was that he had designed the Grand Union supermarkets in America, and Jimmy valued his company and his advice. He really loved Milton, and he loved spending time with him. That's Jimmy Goldsmith on the far left. So much so that he even named one of his favorite racehorses, My Friend Milton. He said it brought him good luck. Anyway, I had even better luck. I got to spend 50 years with my friend Milton. Thank you. Questions, that'll be fine. If not, that's fine too. Yes.
Talk about the concept of the turn-down corner, how it came to be, what it took to get time to do that.
I did that in the prototype. One of the things that Grunwald said is we have to find out how to deal with a second billing. Time often had covers in which they just had the name of the person, or they would write one headline, and usually there was face on the cover of Time, or portrait. By the time we got there, or I got there, Time had evolved to doing more conceptual stories, not always centered on a person, so we had to do more conceptual covers. They weren't always portraits. And at that point, they decided they'd also like a second billing on the cover. Not only the cover story, but something inside. So my thought was how to do that. You know, normally the magazines have been putting a line of type above the logo or something like that. So there were two inspirations for that. One was that I had done a cover for the AIGA in which I folded paper and photographed it, and it worked out very well. And the other was that Milton redesigned, this is before we worked together in early 70s, Harry Match. And he did a promotion for Harry Match in which they turned down a corner of their logo and said Nouveau, so they could promote the idea that it was new. But I thought, what if I could turn down the corner of time and give the viewer a peek at the story that was inside? So we devised this turn down. By the way, I would do it with computer and InDesign now, so that we really look like paper. But in any case, we would run a picture, a little piece of the picture of a story inside and a blur. And I put that on the dummy, which I don't know if I can show you that so easily anymore. In any case, they loved it. I mean, for all I know, that's why they liked the whole design. I mean, Grunwald liked it right away. And in fact, before we launched our first issue, because when I got to Time in July, we couldn't, the mechanics of changing type and getting the staff together and understanding the new design was going to take until October or something. But he put the corner fold on early. And it seemed to work. Became sort of a trademark.
I have a question.
Okay. What time is dinner?
My question is, I'm personally curious too about how you guys work together. I mean, I saw you work together a lot, but when you were both working on one project, could you just talk for a little bit about how that happened? Like, did you have an idea and then you brought it to him, or vice versa? Because it seems like, kind of complicated if you both have strong points of views. And did you ever disagree about anything?
Actually, Milton and I worked together with very little disagreement. Where to go to lunch? One of the things we did, of course, when we were invited, was Milton and I would both go to every meeting. We would meeting with the new client. We spent time in Barcelona, Barcelona newspaper, or the Washington Post, or even at Fortune. And we would definitely, both of us, go to every meeting. Then, back at the studio, Milton was now on the second floor working in Milton Glaser Inc., and we were on the third. But we would just talk about what we thought they needed, what kind of approach we should take, etc. Often, we would sit down together with a sketch pad, a tissue pad, and make some things. But sometimes we just talked about it. Sometimes we met on the stairway between the two floors and talked about it. And then I would go, and we had a staff of about 5 to 7 people. We'd start making, by hand, this is before computers, dummy presentations, not for the client, but for me and Milton to look at. And then we would look at it, etc. Now, Milton was, very fast, very smart, and he worked quickly. Milton was one of those people who did a lot of work, but he came in at 9, he had a lunch, and he went home at 5. Everybody else stayed late, working until all hours of the morning. He worked from 9 to 5, and he got more work done than anybody else. I don't know if that answers your question, because it was never the same. Sometimes we both knew exactly what we should do. Sometimes I would have a thought, and he would build it. Sometimes he would have it. Sometimes some of our staff would come up with something that worked. It wasn't a closed system.
But you never had a time where you had to convince him, be like, no, this is really what we should do.
I can't hear you speak.
I'm saying, did you ever have a time where you had to convince him, to adopt an idea, or you guys were always on the same page? That just seems amazing if you were.
No, look, Milton was my teacher when I first went to SVA, and then he was my boss at New York Magazine, even though we collaborated there. So by the time we were at WBMG, even though we were partners, he was my mentor. you know, if he liked it, I thought it was okay.
Just like you and
He
mom,
was saying,
right?
if he said. Exactly.
How did you?
I think let's just wait for the mic. I think it makes it a little bit easier for everyone to hear.
How did you convince him to have his letter second in WVMG, MG?
It's just, first of all, alphabetical.
Okay.
And secondly, it sounded better. MGWVs didn't roll off the tongue. We didn't realize until we started and put our letterhead out and people started looking, that I got calls that said, this is the Council for Advertising. Would you please broadcast this, free announcement? Because they thought we were a radio station.
Right.
But no, that was not a problem. We spent 5 minutes on that thing. Okay.
I got a question.
Murder.
What did you learn from him when he was?
Well, you know, the first class I took with Milton was with Henry Wolf. Henry Wolf and Milton taught a class together. Henry was a great art director, and he was my inspiration for going into magazine. Milton, at that time's reputation was as an artist, as an illustrator. I didn't even know, well, Pushpin was active, but I didn't even know all the designs of Pushpin. I don't think I had ever seen a Pushpin graphic or anything like that. The course they took was called Designing for the Written Word. And they were talking about interpreting words, writing. And all the assignments were based on that. And it was a real contrast because Henry was a brilliant page designer and art director, but Milton was the one who was articulate. Milton could speak for 5 minutes and send you into real understanding, where Henry and his accent, Viennese accent, just made you feel, oh yeah, somehow that sounds right. But you know, Milton taught us about work. He loved work. He loved work even more than lunch. He really loved to be working. You know, Milton read a lot, that's true, but he didn't go to movies, he didn't go to theater. On the weekends, he didn't play tennis or softball. He worked. He worked all the time. He worked fast, but he loved working. On the building, which is still, that glass is still there, although I'm sure it'll come down any minute, it says, art is work. And that was his philosophy.
I have a question. I remember years and years ago asking you during the week, what's your cover going to be at New York Magazine? And you said, we'll see, because the piece could go, late pieces came, and who was the illustrator who always ended up doing those fancy covers quick?
Everybody worked fast except an artist named Dick Hess. You had to give him months. Paul worked fast, Jim worked fast, Seymour Quast was extremely fast, and Julian Allen was brilliant. Brilliantly quick and brilliantly able to make all sorts of scenes. He did that cover that you saw, Should They Go to Jail, by Ken Oleta. He was wonderful at reproducing scenes that you never saw. He was our main illustrator on the Watergate series. Scenes you knew happened, but had never been recorded visually. He made those up. Working on a weekly was difficult because we had a small staff, and we sometimes did not know our cover as late as Wednesday. Clay would say, God will provide, and then something would happen. And we made a lot of, let me tell you, I remember Wacky Packs and a couple of other terrible covers we did. on the fly and pretty fast, because they all had to be out by Thursday night or Friday morning. And in those days, you had to send things to an engraver and get them perfect. We had great photographers like Carl Fisher who could work extremely quickly. We would call him up like, we won't need a box with Nixon's photograph, and give him a sketch of that, and in 2 days, that box would be ready. He'd photograph it and we'd be on. He did that many times. Time was different. It was a weekly, but we had an army of writers, of illustrators. I'm sorry, I didn't mean illustrators. I mean designers who could redo a section. And we had a layout room of about 12 or 13 people, because everything had to be put down by hand. You could not have one person working on layouts for time. You needed about 13 people, each doing 2 pages at 1 o'clock in the morning to get it on the plane. So, but we had the resources there. And time was always subject to the news. You could plan ahead, you could have a cover. I guess the only thing that wouldn't get knocked off was Man of the Year, unless it was World War III. But often, you'd have a cover ready and something would happen. Like when Jimmy Carter sent the helicopters into Iran. It was a Friday, and they crashed in the desert. Everything had to change. And everybody worked until 4 in the morning. Redoing it. Okay, yes?
Was there any economic sort of criteria for the cover? You said before about the difference between Newsweek and then Time in terms of the amount of magazines that were sold.
We paid $2,500 for cover illustration.
But was there any consideration that this was going to sell more than? or-
No, it was a competition every week, and sometimes you didn't always.
Right.
First of all, Time did have probably more either outlets or promotion, or for all I know, deals with news, stand dealers. Time usually outsold Newsweek, but Newsweek did very well and made profit. Time was a bigger organization, but I don't think we paid differently to either staff or photographers or artists. And we never knew when anything was going to work or not. I mean, we thought something was important and it sold okay. It's something that we weren't sure. The reason that leaky was important to us is because none of the editors thought a science cover, God, nobody's going to buy that. And when that sold over 700,000 copies on the newsstand, the editors woke up. They couldn't believe it. And the writer, Leon Jarrow, who lived in East Hampton, by the way, became the editor of Discover. He had always wanted to start that magazine, but they weren't interested until the leaked cover hit the stand.
Do you miss it? All those
Do
years?
you miss it? That's Linda Frankie, who worked at New York and Newsweek, and God knows what else.
I'm snorting about missing. But yes, I miss it a lot. I wonder whether you do, what you do.
I miss being that age and working that hard, but now I can't put myself in that. I can't believe the hours we put in, or the stress, or the fact that,
Could you talk about your first week at Time and what happened?
the first week at Time. Well, I was led to believe that because Time had all these resources, that I could work normal hours. The first day I got there, I walked in at about 9 o'clock. And by the way, again, this is 1977. I get on the elevator, I go up into the office, there's nobody checking who I am or looking for an identification. I walk in, and there's nobody there. I didn't realize that Time on a Monday started closer to noon. There were a few editors straggling around, etc. But I knew where my office was because they had a sign on it on the 25th floor. So I go into this office, and I'm looking around, and a guy comes in with a box and puts a whole bunch of liquor, bottles of scotch on my desk. And I said, oh my God, who is this from? And I start looking for the card, and I couldn't find the card, and the guy was gone. The next Monday, that same guy came with more liquor. Because if you're the manager, you get to feed the late night staff. And you have to give, drinks are available, and you're the bartender and the keeper of the liquor. But the first week I got there, it was Friday, we were gonna come to Bridgehampton, and I walked into the editor's office. And by the way, it seems funny now, but all the editors, you could not, the top editors, talk to them at Walter Cronkite time. When his newscast came on, they were all riveted. So I happened to walk into Grunwald's office, and Cronkite was on, and something was happening. I didn't pay attention. I said goodnight. He said, "You're not going anywhere." And it turned out that the guy who shot Martin Luther King had just escaped.
James Earl Ray.
And they couldn't find him. And we were going to stay there until they found him. And because that was going to be the cover the next Monday. And so I spent the weekend, my first weekend, Saturday, Sunday. I even called Harvey Dynasty, a wonderful artist, to come and sit with us and draw as they got information about where he was and what route he must have taken into the woods. And then they finally found him within that weekend. But so I welcome to time was not exactly 9 to 5. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. Thanks for coming.